Hello everyone, today I'll be presenting my Johnson Chapter 1 10-minute video assignment. My name is Joseph Brewer and I really appreciate you all giving me a few minutes of your day. So the chapter begins with a scenario that I'm sure a few of us have been confronted with before in our experiences as educators, therapists, and students. The scenario is that of an individual in a clinic that is engaging in problem behaviors that is pestering and negatively affecting this group environment. This individual's behavior are causing a disproportionate amount of time for other therapists to engage with other clients. In other words, this client's problem behaviors are taking away from the therapeutic experience and environment that other clients are choosing to actively engage in. This disruption has led to three individuals, Zoe, Liz, and Sharon, to meet in order to discuss this client's problems and behaviors. Liz mentioned that the client is free to choose. Remember that term, free to choose, is going to be very important later. But Liz is mentioning that that client is free to choose whether or not he wants to engage in activities of interest. Zoe agrees, but wonders out loud what the client's reason could be for not engaging in those activities and what the reasons could be for the client's lack of interest. Liz then states that the client does not have to have a reason, and that the client can choose to ignore staff and refuse to participate for absolutely no reason at all. Zoe then states that what most of not all people that are behavior therapists or BCBAs would say, and that the client's consequence of problem behavior must be reinforced by something that is causing him to do so. So she continues to wonder what that could be. Liz and Sharon do not agree or even acknowledge Zoe's reasoning. So Sharon goes on to state that the client is no less free than she is to make a choice. In order to extinguish the problematic nature of this conversation is becoming, Zoe decides to back off from her reasoning and redirect in order to bring the meeting to a more practical discussion. So this leads me to my first open-ended question. Please post your thoughts and opinions on this situation and what you would have done in Zoe's situation if you were the BCBA. The previous scenario leads us to the question, are disruptive behaviors the result of outside influences or the choices one makes, also known as inside influences? One's argument from the inside influence would imply that one's final course of decision-making comes internally, even though there are outside environmental influences, but those are considered secondary to one's mental deliberations. In layman's terms, those external environmental influences are not the primary reason for one's actions. It's one's own internal deliberations which override those factors and lead to an action. When one says that their decision-making is free of outside influence, this is the essence of the classical philosophical position of free will. Free will means that one's will, or the ability to control one's own actions, is entirely their own, meaning it is not influenced by any outside force, environmental, or hereditary factor. In this comic, you will see a cartoon rendition of an angel and God sitting atop of a cloud looking down at Earth, where humans, animals, and all types of species are making decisions. The depiction of the angel looks to God and says, "Hey, don't look at me, I was against free will." This cartoon is making light of the fact that it was God, for those of you that believe this to be true, is the one that gave all creatures the ability of free will. I thought this comic was fitting and funny way to look at free will. Hopefully you all enjoyed it and didn't take it too seriously. I don't mean to offend anyone by adding this to my presentation. So let's go ahead and move on. One's argument for the outside influence would imply that one's final course of decision-making comes externally or from outside environmental factors, even though there are internal influences, but those are considered secondary to hereditary and environmental factors when we're talking about determinism. In layman's terms, those internal influences are not the primary reason for one's actions. It's one's own hereditary and environmental factors which override those internal factors that lead to an action. When one says their decision-making is primarily influenced by their hereditary environment, this is in the essence of the classical philosophical position of determinism. Determinism gives the assumption that behavior is determined by physical variables, such as hereditary and environmental influences. This view has been a respected position in natural science field for a long time. So just imagine trying to explain the physical universe, but with the notion that individuals or phenomenon in that universe can do things for internal reasons, which could absolutely mean for no reason at all. In this comic, you will see a cartoon rendition of a person shrugging their arms and shoulders saying, "I wanted to draw a comic about free will, but I decided not to." Now, this comic could technically go towards both arguments, but the fact that they that the character is outside has me thinking has me thinking that the character was inside and they're drawing a comic about free will, which they're deciding to go outside for a walk instead. The point being that there was an environmental influence of the fictional character's decision making. But I must say that I can come up with an argument for both free will as well as determinism. Now let's move on to some of the common arguments and issues against both free will and determinism. First, let's start with free will. So, quick review. Free will is the assumption that our actions are primarily decided from internal mental deliberations rather than being influenced by outside factors. Would it ever be possible to gather evidence proving that a behavior can be free of environmental causation? I don't believe so, since there's no physical or tangible way you can prove that someone truly made a decision based on internal factors, only with no influence from outside or physical source. With that being said, how can one person truly prove free will? It would be seemingly impossible to eliminate the roles of physical or environmental factors when showing why behavior occurs. Another assumption of free will is that we can control our own actions, meaning that we are devoid of any physical or environmental factors, which would also mean that any behavior would be random or without explanation. Try saying that during a TED Talk lecture about behavior. Now to the three issues. First, how can non-physical factors influence physical events, such as behaviors? For example, how would one explain in a fight and one's internal decision making of hitting somebody back? Is it because they got hit, the physical influence, or is it because they mentally associate getting hit with something negative mentally, so they hit back? Next, can outside or environmental factors never be the reason for someone to do something? Is one responsibility of an action solely based on how they mentally compartmentalize the situation and not the physical environmental factor around them? Does this mean there can never be accidents? Lastly, choice. Can it be true that every choice that we make is primarily decided by our own mental deliberations as opposed to the physical situations that we are in during that choice? Now let's talk about some of the common arguments and issues against determinism. So let's do another quick review. Determinism is the assumption that actions are primarily decided from hereditary and environmental factors rather than by internal and mental deliberations of an individual. So would it ever be possible to gather evidence proving that a behavior can be free of mental deliberation and solely on the basis of environmental factors? I don't believe so, since there's no way to prove that one did not mentally deliberate their actions as opposed to reacting to the stimuli in their physical environment. It would be seemingly impossible to eliminate roles of mental deliberation when showing why a behavior occurs. Now on to the three issues. First, how can a determinist explain the complex and multifaceted reasoning for why an individual is acting in a specific behavior while in a situation? For example, how would one explain why someone is afraid of the dark when they are alone, but not afraid of the dark when they are with somebody? A determinist could argue that the physical environment changed, but the reason could be far more complex than that. It may be that the person was locked in a room alone when they were a child, causing them to have these feelings when they are older. Next, if we assume that our choices are determined by outside factors, can an individual ever be held responsible for his or her own behavior? Lastly, choice, which ties right back into the first issue of complex reasoning. How would a determinist truly understand one's choice if one does not appreciate the mental factors that are potentially responsible for the environmental influence of their decision? Lastly, here are some terms that were highlighted throughout the chapter. Please pause this video and take a chance to review these terms and how they would be important in the free will versus determinism discussion. Thanks everyone for listening to my PowerPoint presentation. I really hope you enjoyed it. Here is my open-ended question that reads, what factors do you take into account when engaging in a specific behavior? Post your scenario and factor you are taking into account when in that scenario. Thanks again, everyone, and I sure hope you have a fantastic day.